everyone. I won't do an introduction because you know who I am, but today, as Amy said, I'll just dig a little bit further into nickel and cobalt, kind of what we're seeing as the key themes. Just briefly on who Benchmark are for those who are less familiar. As I said at the beginning, we're focusing on the lithium-ion battery supply chain. We do a number of products you can see there within that supply chain. Anything really within that we're covering, and we're trying to go deeper and deeper as we go. The team's growing very quickly. We've now got kind of upwards of 120 people globally. I'm within the consultancy division, so we do more bespoke advisory services, but you can see that there's a spectrum of offerings there. So I'll touch on a little bit of what I spoke about in the panel, but hopefully provide a little bit more detail, and happy to answer questions at the end as well. So I'll talk you through where we're seeing the battery market going, how the nickel market structure is changing, and kind of why that's important for how everything's mapping out. How Indonesia are pivoting towards that supply chain, and we're seeing a lot of movement in Indonesia, and then talk a little bit about some of the risks at the end. So I mentioned these numbers, so I've already given a little bit of a spoiler on this, but you can see that there's been quite a big ramp up in cathode or battery demand, cathode going into those batteries over the last few years, particularly in 2020 for electric vehicles. And we're now kind of approaching the 1,000 gigawatt hour, 1 terawatt hour threshold. But in the grand scheme of things, this is actually quite small because we've really only just started that ramp up, and there's still a long way to go towards 8 or more terawatt hours in the long term. And just looking the breakdown of those regions, China is obviously a major region for electric vehicles sales at the moment, and they remain the largest market. But the US or North America and Europe combined will grow rapidly over the coming years, and you can see that those regions start to overtake China in a combined way, and that's very positive for nickel and cobalt in particular, because those markets, as I mentioned earlier on, are more NCM focused, whereas China is more of an LFP market. So the rise of the EU and North America is particularly important to consider for nickel and cobalt demand. And this is our kind of overall view for cathode chemistries. You can see that really it's a two-part market. We've got LFP in the kind of the ready orange color, which is actually stronger than NCM at the moment, but we're not expecting that to maintain in the long term. We expect the NCM chemistries and that group to maintain a higher share in the mid and long term, and within that group we'll move towards higher nickel and cobalt or higher nickel intensities and lower cobalt intensities. So that shift is beneficial for nickel. It slows cobalt demand growth down a little bit, but overall it's still very positive. But at the same time, we have heard from some of the battery producers recently that perhaps there isn't such a requirement to go to the really, really high nickel chemistries. So that will be an interesting kind of dynamic to keep an eye on, as that does have an impact on how much growth there will be for nickel and cobalt demand. So yeah, good question. So we've seen a lot of LFP strength in recent years, particularly in China, low cost, a lot of capacity building out. But we kind of have starting to hit the ceiling of those energy density improvements. We've seen cell to pack technology, we've seen BYD's blade. So we've seen the energy density increase quite markedly in the last couple of years, and LFP had kind of been written off a few years ago. But particularly the pack and vehicle level energy density has improved quite a lot. But the nickel cobalt chemistries haven't really been pushed that hard yet. They've already got a good base to go off. So we're seeing much more upside in those markets. I think another thing to consider here, this is on an energy basis. So an LFP vehicle has typically got a smaller battery than an NCM vehicle. So there's a bit of a balancing act there, and that's why Europe and North America are important too, because the average battery size is larger. So that has like an additional impact on demand. So this isn't on a vehicle basis, this is on a total energy basis. So just now looking a bit more into what we've seen in nickel in the last couple of years, there's obviously been a lot of volatility in the nickel market, given what happened, the LME short squeeze last year. There's been numerous issues with the LME, and that meaning that there's not a huge amount of confidence in the LME as a platform going forward. So that's still developing kind of how pricing structures develop and how the overall market starts to sell into the battery market as opposed to the kind of the more traditional stainless steel markets. So on the left, you can see how we're seeing stainless steel and battery demand developing over time. The stainless steel market is still 2/3 of the market, so it's still very much a non-battery market, unlike lithium and cobalt, which are very heavily leveraged off batteries these days. And you can see that it's going to take a long time for that battery demand to actually overtake stainless steel, but at the same time, it's growing very quickly. We're not seeing a huge amount of growth in stainless steel demand, particularly at the moment with kind of macroeconomic headwinds in China. So all the growth really is for battery demand, but it's coming off a much lower base. But you can see on the right how we've seen a big shift in the way that the supply chain is set up for nickel sulfate going into those batteries. So the grey line has fallen off quite markedly. The feedstock going into that nickel sulfate was traditionally a lot of class 1 dissolution, but we've seen these two new routes in the orange and the red from MHP and MAT, particularly in Indonesia, enabling a whole new supply chain to develop to source that nickel sulfate. And going forwards, we're certainly seeing that MHP is the primary feedstock for that nickel sulfate, and that's why we're seeing a lot of development, particularly in Indonesia, for that part of the supply chain. Yeah, so I'll get onto some of the ESG risks later on, but yeah, there's certainly something to think about. I don't know whether the pointer will work particularly well here, but this is quite a complicated chart, so just bear with me. The main things to focus on is kind of 1 and 2 on the right-hand side here. So the first is that laterite MHP to sulfate route. And that's really where we're seeing a lot of the growth in these supply chains. As I mentioned, MHP is the key feedstock for nickel sulfate now and increasingly going forwards. We're seeing a lot of high pressure acid leach capacity building out in China. There's already 3 or 4 assets operating. A couple of years ago, there was none. And the pipeline is growing and growing almost by the day. The second one is the number 2 route. So this is a route that didn't exist a couple of years ago. We had very segregated class 1 and class 2 markets. So the kind of the class 1 traditional market for stainless steel. But now that MPI to MAT route has allowed an entirely new supply chain to develop and means that there's a lot more flexibility between the two parts of the market. And as a result, we're seeing a much more merged market, and that impacts the way in which prices develop and how the market balances in periods of over or under supply. And now a bit more on Indonesia. There's a lot on Indonesia because they're a rising force, but the kind of the major traditional sources of nickel have come from sulfide deposits, but that has really ground to a halt. There's very little development now for new sulfide projects globally. All of the growth really is for laterite, primarily from Indonesia, but also from the Philippines and other places. But there hasn't really been a lot of development in nickel sulfide, and some of that is to do with that flow sheet that I showed previously, but also some of it is just due to their cost competitiveness. And we're not seeing that the North American sulfide projects that are in the pipeline at the moment will be particularly competitive, and they're likely to be kind of around kind of the marginal producer in the base case. And I mentioned these stats earlier on. You can see how quickly nickel production in Indonesia has grown over the last kind of 8 years. and we're expecting that line to continue upwards to kind of 60-70%. Those two routes that I mentioned earlier on, the MHP route via HPAL and the MPI to MAC conversion, they're really key to keep an eye on in the future of the nickel market. That number one is where all the volume growth is at the moment. The MPI to MAT route probably won't be quite as competitive on a cost basis or a ESG basis, but it is likely to provide swing supply as needed, and will continue to be important for the stainless steel sector as well. And we touched on this in the panel, but it's always important to flag is that the Indonesian supply chain, particularly focused on batteries, is continuing to gain a lot of momentum. We're seeing big commitments from major mid and downstream players. LG, Volkswagen, Ford, Tesla are apparently thinking about it too. In recent weeks, we've seen Gotion, one of the major Chinese battery producers, invest in an HPAL project in Indonesia as well. So all of these companies are ensuring that they've got security of supply, as we discussed, but also looking into whether a downstream sector can be developed in Indonesia, whether we can go beyond that MHP production into nickel sulfate. The first producer started that last year, called PT Legend, on the eastern side of Indonesia, and I went to visit their operation earlier this year. So they're the first asset to produce nickel sulfate in Indonesia, and there's certainly plans from the other HPAL operations to go that next step downstream. And I think the more we see major OEM involvement such as this, there's more chance of going beyond nickel sulfate into the mid and downstream. And Hyundai, for example, are looking at EV production in the country as well. So this is just really just showing kind of where we've come and where we're going. So this chart shows that in the 5 years from 2015 to 2020, globally, the nickel market was very focused on stainless steel. Obviously, that's where all the demand growth was. Batteries weren't really a big theme for nickel back then. It probably was 5 to 10% of demand, if that. But you can see the green bars, all ferronickel and MPI, all sourcing that kind of wave of stainless steel demand, particularly in China and other parts of the world. There's a big pullback in metal production. Most of it was unprofitable. And ironically, we've seen a lot of new metal capacity come back online in the last couple of years, despite a lot of it being closed down then. But going forward, so from 2020 to 2030, you can see that that's changed quite markedly. So that all of that MHP supply is coming to the market. Almost half of growth to 2030 will come from MHP. There is, of course, ferronickel and MPI supply growth for stainless steel, but that pink matte color, that again didn't exist a few years ago, and that was that number 2 route that I showed previously. So we're really seeing a pivot in the nickel market at the moment to new supply routes to enable enough nickel going into the battery supply chain going forwards. And this really shows that is that you can see the yellow MHP color didn't exist a few years ago, really, apart from the odd project here and there, particularly the matte. Again, wasn't a major route, but that's where we're seeing all of the growth now, and it means that the more traditional metal and ferronickel MPI sectors are losing overall share as the whole supply chain pivots towards the growth market, which is batteries. And just looking ahead, this just reinforces how much growth potential there is for Indonesia in the long term. We were about 50% of the overall market this year, but that could increase to 60-70%. This is on an unweighted basis, so not all of the projects will necessarily reach the market, but even if some of them don't, you can still see that there's a huge amount of additional potential even from where we are today. And yeah, globally, most of that growth will be coming from MHP, from laterites, as opposed to some of the more traditional supply routes for nickel. And I haven't talked a lot about Cobalt today. I'm happy to have a chat about it afterwards, but I just thought I'd include this for completeness. But you can see that it's still very much a DRC market for Cobalt. That's not going to change. But you can also see that they are starting to lose share in the mid to long term, which hasn't happened almost ever for the Cobalt market. And I was there earlier this year, and the government are quite aware of that. They kind of realize they might have missed a bit of an opportunity. There's obviously a huge amount of political governance risk in that part of the world, and that's on top of the huge amount of scrutiny they've had about child labour in artisanal supply. So there's a huge amount of barriers to come over for the country, but there is clear ambition to try and go further downstream, and there's been announcements on that even in the last few weeks. But you can see the growth in Indonesia does actually start to eat into the DRC's share, and that's really it used to just be a DRC story, and now actually Indonesia is starting to support quite a lot of cobalt supply growth as well. And now just to wrap up on some of the risks. This is a really nice chart because it just shows how much the Indonesian pipeline has built even in the last 2 years. So we're now tracking about 90 nickel projects and more than 50 cobalt projects in Indonesia, primarily for HPAL. But you can see in early 2021, that pipeline was pretty small. So this is gaining momentum, and every time we do an update, we're adding new projects to the pipeline. But that, of course, comes with some development risk. So the whole industry really can't rely entirely on Indonesia, and that's why we need to see continued supply investment in other parts of the supply chain. But some of those factors there are important. Will the OEMs accept all of the material out of Indonesia for ESG or other reasons? Where will Indonesia fit within the IRA? In particular, they're not currently an FTA country. There's kind of expectation that they will get some kind of trade agreement. It won't be a full FTA, but there is expectation that they will be able to fit some way within the IRA. But then the level of Chinese ownership in these projects is very high, and that's another barrier to overcome. So there's still a lot to work through when it comes to Indonesia's position on a global level. There's a clear supply chain already between Indonesia and China, but certainly the likes of the US are looking to tap into what is a huge nickel laterite resource. And then I'll touch on ESG in a second, but this is a good chart to show the impact of the IRA and how pivotal it's been for the battery supply chain. So it was announced in August last year. You can see the US were quite a long way behind Europe in their 10-year battery pipeline. But that's caught up already, and we're seeing a lot of investment shifting away from other regions into the US to try and tap into the huge amount of incentives that are available. And we're then also starting to see this filter up the supply chain into nickel, into cobalt, into lithium, and they ensuring that there's enough raw materials to source to go into these batteries. And just touching on ESG, because I had a question on it earlier on, and it's critically important for the whole supply chain. It's certainly gaining a lot more momentum in investment decisions, but for nickel in particular, it's got a lot of discussion because of Indonesia's role. It's in a very sensitive part of the world. They're using process routes that aren't necessarily the best on kind of an ESG level, but seem to be the best to kind of fit within the broader supply chain. But here just shows two of our metrics that we do as part of our life cycle assessments. On the left is kind of the more traditional CO2 equivalent, but on the right you can see terrestrial acidification. And the HPAL route in yellow, you can see that it's important to look at not just the carbon, you've got to look at the acidification, and we've got a number of different metrics that we look at as well. But you can see for HPAL, the carbon intensity is relatively low compared to other nickel routes, but for acidification, it's much higher, and that's some of the challenges that this supply chain has got to overcome. The RKEF route, which is kind of the traditional stainless steel route, is very carbon and acid intensive. So that won't necessarily be successful, and that's shown very clearly on this chart, showing a carbon intensity by route again. So these are all of the kind of the factors that the supply chain is considering, but certainly there's a spectrum of ESG compliance in Indonesia, and I saw that when I was there earlier this year. Some of the operations are doing well, some of them are doing less well, and that will impact their ability to start to access the Western supply chains in particular. So there's just a few takeaways for today. I think that the main one is really the one at the bottom, and will we start to see bifurcation of these markets due to ESG or due to policy, and that's really the thing to keep an eye on, is how nickel units might start to feed into the US and Europe, or they might start to feed into China, and how policy will impact that, and also how ESG considerations will impact that as well. Thank you very much. Probably got time for a few questions.
Thanks, Harry. You had that slide that showed the number of projects that you guys monitor. Is there any criteria to those projects, or are they just is there a cut-off to what projects you're looking at, or are they just...
So
what's the...
Yeah, good question. We've got a pretty consistent approach to supply benchmarks. We've got a ranking system for development projects. We try and capture as much as we can, just so there's a clear view of kind of what the potential is. But yeah, there will be a spectrum. I've charted it before, kind of what's probable, what's possible within that. But it does include early stage projects. So some of them won't be coming online for another 10 years, perhaps. But I think regardless, you can see that this is just continuing to gain momentum. I don't think I've seen a quarterly update in the last year that hasn't seen a big jump in the number of projects. And if you look at the news, you're seeing, particularly for H-Power, you're seeing a lot of announcements almost week on week, and commitments from major players as well. I mentioned Goshen, that was a particularly interesting one. There's a lot of Chinese interest in Indonesia. That's mostly where the investment's coming from, but there are other companies looking at it as well.
In the manufacture of stainless steel, which nickel takes a lot of, there's certain grades of stainless steel, 200, 300, 600, 900. Can laterite, the product, the nickel from laterite, be used in any of those grades, or is it limited to the lower grade, like 200?
It's a good question. I'm not a stainless steel expert, I will admit that, but I'm pretty sure that they can source some of those grades. Some of it may need to be upgraded, but the nickel industry in Indonesia for many years has been focused on stainless steel. They produce stainless steel in the country, but they also produce the intermediates that go to China for stainless steel production. So there may be limits on that, but it's the interesting thing to note is that the saprolite resource of the laterite has been what's been mined and processed up to now. And now it's the limonite, which is on top of these laterite deposits, that is being processed for H-Power. So in the past, they've mined the laterite off the top, stockpiled it to the side, and processed the saprolite. And now they've enabled the H-Power route to reprocess effectively waste, and pivot that into the battery supply chain.
I think it was about a week, 10 days ago, Financial Times did an article on the devastation that the nickel mines are having in Indonesia. Interested in your thoughts, opinions, obviously based on your studies, how this can impact nickel resources in Ardea in Australia that potentially are more expensive, high capex because it's HPAL. What impact does it have on those projects, on their likelihood to succeed, find capital, produce at a profit?
So there's probably two or three things to think about, which is what I often say to people. Is the first is obviously production cost and capital cost. That's always in these industries. That's always going to be one of the biggest barriers for any high cost project. Is you might have all the credentials under the sun, but if you're high cost, then you're going to struggle to get up and even get funding. Increasingly for nickel, and I think I touched on that quite a few times, is the route you're taking. Nickel's not really becoming all the same. It's MHP is really the king at the moment, and that's why companies are struggling to kind of fight against that. And the more that goes on, the downstream sets up for that. And a nickel sulfate producer can use a different feedstock, but they need to set up a different line. So it's not like 1 week they can use MHP, the next week they can use MAT. They need to be set up for that, and that means that the production route and the intermediate product that you're looking to sell, say to the battery supply chain, which is really where most of the nickel producers are looking now, that's important. ESG it will become more important, but I think for now it's probably not a huge it's not a huge factor at the moment, but going forwards that will increase. Going to your question, there is a lot of press coverage of environmental issues in Indonesia, and they do exist. But what I always say to people is it's not all the same. Some of the operators are aiming for world-class standards. Some are clearly not achieving that and maybe aren't even aiming for that, but there is a spectrum. So don't read one article and assume that every nickel unit coming out of Indonesia is the same. That's probably as far as I'll go on that. There's a significant amount of Chinese investment and expertise. I think that's the thing. It's not all just cash. These HPAL operations wouldn't be running the way they are without the technological expertise. HPAL as a technology has kind of been written off. Nobody thought it was going to be as successful as it has been, and it just keeps gaining and gaining and gaining. And that a lot of that's down to the Chinese partners in these JVs. But that may start to have issues for IRA compliance going forwards.